Okay, welcome to our final panel of Alfabeti del Corpo. I'm Montana Ray. I first want to say thank you to Jen Zobel for inviting me to work on this symposium with her. It has been a pleasure and one of the highlights of my time at NYU New York. Also, thank you to everyone at NYU Florence, and especially Lucia, although she's not here. But she's made the conference run so beautifully and fluidly, and has been created such a beautiful gathering. I'm honored and delighted to moderate this panel on feminism, Marxism, and abolition. The root of this topic, or the reason I kind of wanted to explore it, was an observation of various translations and re-releases of Marxist Italian feminist texts into the languages I work with, so Spanish and Portuguese. And the ways in which those translations were feeding movement workers in Latin America. So for example, Tinta Limón, a press in Argentina, is just now re-releasing Caliban y la Bruja, and Veronica Gago has been one of the editors there who's championed that project, has been very involved in Ni Una Menos, the kind of movement against femicide in Argentina. And another example is a group of translators who work collaboratively in Brazil. They're a feminist anti-capitalist collective called Coletivo Scorax. And they've also recently translated Caliban y la Bruja by Silvia Federici, as well as several of her other works. And I've also been interested in the way that the kind of long Caribbean from the US South to Brazil has responded to Italian Marxist feminists, even from coevals like Angela Davis and her critique of the wages for housework movement. The people, I'm gonna very, very briefly, there are bios of everyone in the panel in your portfolio, but I also want to say just a few things about each person because they're very special people, and I'm very honored to present their work here. So Tiana Reid is a writer and scholar from Toronto at York University in the English department, and she's going to discuss the work of Italian feminist Leopoldina Fortunati and how that work has been read by Fred Moten. Next, I'm going to read them in the order that we'll go. So Patricia Baggi is also going to discuss a really fantastically interesting project of translating Silvia Federici into Italian, so a more recent translation. And then Christina Chalmers is a doctoral student at NYU, and she will discuss translations of the word housework. Yes, and Marie Mosey will discuss her translations of Black feminist thinkers Angela Davis, Bell Hooks, and Greta Quilomba.
Hi everyone, it's really good to be here, and thanks. My gratitude goes to the organizers. A lot of labor must go into putting on something like this. Many people involved, so I hold a lot of gratitude for them. And I do this thing where I go to conferences and I have my talk planned, and then if I'm presenting on the second or third day, I've radically revised what I wanted to say, and that's usually a good thing because I want to be in conversation with what has taken place. And one thing I was thinking about with the title of this conference is, or the subtitle of this conference rather, is Gender, Translation, and Activism. And I don't really consider myself an activism necessarily, and I don't really specialize in the history of protest or activism. So I was kind of thinking to myself, what is my way into this urgent conversation? And I just wanted to start by sort of saying a few words. I'm a Columbia University graduate, and I've been here in Italy watching what is happening in New York in terms of the arrests and the evictions, and it's been weighing very heavily on me. And so I kind of just wanted to start by expressing solidarity with student activists who have been organizing for Palestine at Columbia, but also where I work at York University and also at NYU and elsewhere. Activists who have been expelled and evicted and retaliated against. And so my lingering question before I begin my more formal remarks is, how can we refuse the imperial institutions that often celebrate activism in the abstract or in the historical, like Colombia's obsession with 1968, rather than supporting the contemporary activism that is happening on the ground and on our own campuses and by our own students. I'm a professor. And so with that, I'm going to begin to talk a little bit about my project and how I began to become interested in Italian Marxist feminist writing. And I think the phrase itself is a necessary shorthand, Italian Marxist feminism. But I was especially interested in grad school in thinking about how they subverted or interrupted autonomous, workerist, and feminist movements. So they kind of critiqued all of them from the inside. And today I'm going to be reading a couple sections of my manuscript in progress, which is very tentatively titled Desire Factory, Black Women's Figurations of Unorganized Labor, and it's about literature and labor in Black diasporic literature. This is what I'm presenting today is a bit of the sort of like method or preparatory work. And I don't so much study Italian Marxist feminist theory as an object or as a discrete entity. I'm more interested, hopefully you'll see, in studying their method and their approach and how the way they're sort of used and taken up in Anglophone Black studies, for example. So I'm going to give two examples. The first and the most sustained is what Montana mentioned, which is Fred Moten's use of Leopoldina Fortunati in his book In the Break, The Aesthetics of the Black Radical Tradition. And then the second that kind of builds on that is just, I'll touch on Silvio Federici's work in light of Black struggle, which is a huge topic in itself. So in both instances, I hope that you'll see how the figure of the Black woman is sort of in the background and becomes an instrument for theory. And so just to sort of gloss what has become known as social reproduction theory, and of course, the Italians that I'm discussing today are in conversation with the larger internationalist movement, and Angela Davis critiques them at one point, Wages for Housework. But social reproduction theory has become sort of like a discrete field in many ways, and I can talk about later sort of some of the challenges with that. But it attempts to make a certain kind of human labor visible. And so often it refers to what is known as biological reproduction, childbearing, housework, caretaking, emotional labor, feminized, service industries. But it isn't only the work of women. And it doesn't happen only at home, though that is often the privileged site of analysis, but social reproduction also takes places here, in hospitals, in prisons. Joy James is someone who has talked about the captive maternal, and that's a way to sort of ungender forms of caretaking that are sort of extracted by the state. Okay, so moving to the first of my two case studies for this talk, I became really interested in Fred Moten's reading of Leopoldina Fortunati's feminist critique of Karl Marx in her book, The Arcane of Reproduction, Housework, Prostitution, Labor, and Capital. And the English was translated by Hilary Creek and published in '95, which was, I think, 14 years after the Italian was published. And so that chapter in Fred Moten's In the Break, in my field in Black Studies, it's well known, very rehearsed often, but the focus is often on the sort of reproduction of violence. And so I became really interested in how I had never really seen an extended reading of Fred Moten reading this Italian theorist. And so in that first chapter, he is concerned with the historical transition from slave labor to quote-unquote free wage labor. And I want to suggest that Moten's figuration of Black maternity prefigures his analysis of Fortunati's affirmative and generative critique of Marx. In other words, Moten prefaces his critique of Fortunati, who is herself critiquing Marx, by tying together mother and enslavement as these constitutive, conceptual elements of Blackness. And so in Moten's case, the maternal comes to signify reproduction itself. And a lot of work has been done since that book was published and emphasizing how reproductive labor is many-gendered. And through reading reproduction, a Black maternity emerges in the name of radicalism. In other words, Black maternity is rendered into an example to narrate revolutionary possibility. And, for those who maybe haven't read In the Break, the book is really in the service of developing a theory of Black sound, Black aesthetics, Black performance that marks a kind of sonic materiality in which the maternal becomes representative. So there's this relationship between material and maternal or matter. In the Break, Moten reproduces a long quote from Fortunati's first chapter, where she aims to outline the way in which capitalism built a fence between reproduction and production. Whereas capitalist modes of production consisted of a unity between reproduction and production, capitalism decisively separates the two, argues Fortunati. And it is by moving quickly through Marx and Fortunati's inability, in Moten's words, to think the articulation of the slave and the commodity that Moten arrives at his theory of the commodity who speaks, right? The enslaved person as a commodity who speaks. Moten writes that the presence of the commodity within the individual is an effect of reproduction, a trace of maternity. In short, I wondered about how motherhood becomes the constitutive background to reproduction and how reproduction morphs into these recognizable forms of a woman's body. And even as Fortunati's own model blurs the historical differences between slavery and serfdom and feudalism, as she sort of wants to figuratively speed this up for the sake of her methodology to get to sort of like the thing, which is the arrival of capitalism, one of her crucial and most important points, I think, is not simply how reproduction produces value, but also how important it is to denaturalize gendered forms of exploitation. So my question here is, how does Moten's critique of Fortunati, how is it in conversation with other ways in which Black maternity is rendered into an example in service of the Black radical tradition? Moten really focuses on the first chapter of Fortunati's book, which is called Reproduction and Production, the Apparent Antithesis of the Capitalist Mode of Productions. And arguably, you could say that this chapter is less of a feminist critique than the rest of the book, which is focusing on later, it's more focused on unpaid domestic work, sex work, social relations between men and women, notions of the family, et cetera. All of which were very much a concern for the wages for housework movement in the 70s. And so what we learn here, in sum, is that whereas Moten renders an example of Black motherhood into a tentative naturalization, we can also see how later on the constitutive backdrop to his ideas, wages for housework, we also see how the image of a Black mother gets rendered for politically useful ends. And my example here is my second point, which is in the introduction to Federici's Revolution at Point Zero, Housework, Reproduction, and Feminist Struggle, which is a collection of essays from 75 to 2012. She offers what I find to be a very lucid definition of reproduction as, quote, the complex activities and relations by which our life and labor are daily reconstituted. I'll read that again. The complex of activities and relations by which our life and labor are daily reconstituted. And I think this meaning is broad enough to sort of throw Moten's exemplary motherhood into crisis. And Federici has explicitly, graciously, and retroactively stated that wages for housework derived a Black struggle of welfare mothers as the first example of feminism in the US in the 60s, as they were ones to demand a wage from the state for the work of raising their children. So once again, we see how the Black mother as a figure becomes the tool, or a tool, I should say, for these broader theories of reproduction. So what does it mean for Black women to live as an example? This is sort of where my work takes off from. What does it mean to live in that everyday experience of being rendered into an example for aesthetic theory and social movements? And I wanted to just end with a little quote from an essay by, a more recent essay by Fortunati called Learning to Struggle, My Theory Between Workerism and, My Story, between Workerism and Feminism. And it's a piece that I often go back to, and in light of the last day and a half, it struck me that when you read this reflection, it's apparent that Fortunati saw her writing, Arcane of Reproduction, as a way to narrate her own investment in social movement. She said that she wrote the book because of the practical needs of the movement. So the text itself has activist political purposes. And in a way, my story between workerism and feminism resonated for me with the between in one of the titles from one of the panels yesterday, right? So what does it mean to be between political movements, and what kinds of acts of translation happen in that space where you're in one movement and you have to interrupt it in order to really move it forward. And so I'll just end with a quote. She says, we needed to clarify and explain, first of all to ourselves, then to the entire movement, why militants needed to go beyond the Marxist categories and in which sense. For example, in which terms could women be considered working class? Which women? Thanks.
Patricia.
Okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to be very practical, as I'm not a scholar. I'm just a translator, and I brought you an example. So I wanted to start talking about who Silvia Federici is, even though I think you all know her. She's one of the most prominent Marxist feminists of our time, and she's still a prolific writer who reflects on the impact of capitalism on women. And she co-founded the Wages for Housework movement, as my colleague said, and which was a movement that demanded a salary, basically, for housewives, as these women were working for the state in the home by doing 3 types of work: housework, reproductive work, and care work. And the ideas that Federici birthed during the time spent in the organization will permeate all her work and are very much present in Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, which is the book I translated last year. Why am I here? I'm sure you're all wondering. I was invited by Jennifer thanks to the translation I did of Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, which is Oltre la periferia della pelle in Italian. And I will quickly introduce my background to give you a glimpse of how the market works in Italy for translators. So I studied foreign languages in Milan at university, where I attended a translation course taught by Franca Cavagnoli, who is the most important translator of post-colonial literature in Italian. And it was during her classes that I fell in love with the complexities of translation and its challenges. So after completing my master's degree, I got accepted into the Agenzia Tutta Europa course on editorial translation held in Turin, in Piedmont, where I discovered what I really enjoyed doing, which is translating essays. So despite all my studies, I had to take on jobs as a salesperson and customer care specialist, as I didn't have the funding to just look for translation jobs. And the opportunities for new translators in Italy are limited, and the few available spots are well protected by the old guard. However, after years of frustration, I told myself that I had to take my chances and try to do what I thought was the right thing to do, which was translating. So I started sending out my CV to publishing companies, asking for a translation test, and Di Editore, the publisher of Oltre la periferia della pelle, was one of the companies that responded to my request. And then everything happened pretty quickly. Emanuele, the chief editor of Di Editore, asked me if I knew who Silvia Federici was. I told him yes. And he then revealed to me that he was in talks with her to republish all of her work in Italian. So I did the translation test, which was the preface of Beyond the Periphery of the Skin, passed it, and began translating the whole book. So what were the challenges of translating Silvia Federici's work into Italian? First of all, she's a luminary. As I have mentioned, she's one of the most well-known Marxist feminists, and she is a writer whose work continues to have immense impact on feminists all over the world. Secondly, she's still alive, and to take care of someone else's work while they can still review it themselves is intimidating, to say the least. So I was afraid of getting some parts wrong and of ruining her work, which I deeply respect. And although I could have asked her to clear any doubts I might have had, I didn't want to bother a legend. In addition to that, what also scared me was that she's of Italian mother tongue. Even though her production is in English, her first language is Italian. And therefore, in agreement with the editor, we decided to let her review the translation before publishing it, which was quite nerve-wracking. Okay. As for the risk of polarization, what I'm referring to here are three specific topics: mainstream feminism, surrogacy, and race. These are hot topics in Italy, generating much debate online. And since Federici has strong opinions and goes right to the point, I had to work on the sentence structure to ensure that the message was conveyed accurately without causing too much polarization among her readers. This is the original text. Let me read it. More importantly, surely we can conceive of experiences like maternity, child raising, and social subordination to men as constituting a common terrain of struggle for women, even if it is one in which contrasting strategies may develop. Are alternative identities, such as gay, trans, and queer, less subject to fragmentation on the basis of class, race, ethnic origin, and age? This is my first attempt at translating. Possiamo davvero concepire esperienze quali la maternità, l'accudimento dei figli e la subordinazione sociale nei confronti degli uomini come terreno comune per la lotta delle donne, sebbene da esso possano scaturire strategie contrastanti? Altre identità, come quella gay, trans e queer, sono meno soggette alla frammentazione sulla base di classe, etnia ed età? Ok, this is the final translation. È lecito considerare esperienze quali la maternità, l'accudimento dei figli e la subordinazione sociale nei confronti degli uomini come terreno di sofferenze comuni alle donne, sebbene da esso possano scaturire strategie contrastanti? Le altre identità di una donna, come quella gay, trans e queer, sono davvero meno soggette alla frammentazione sulla base di classe, etnia ed età? I don't know if you get it, because it's in Italian, but I'll try to explain what I did. So I tried to generalize the overall concept being expressed in the source text by using the plural donne instead of the singular donna. And I also replaced lotta with sofferenza to better illustrate the extremely difficult situation women go through, which is not entirely conveyed by the word lotta, as the latter implies an agency that can obfuscate the suffering part of it all. Choosing one word over the other was an attempt to make the reader sympathize with the subjects described while still going straight to the point. And I also linked the other identities to that of woman to remark that a woman can be and is all that. In doing so, I believe that what Federici was trying to communicate was conveyed in a better and less polarizing way. If I had decided to stick with a more literal translation, she might have come across as a TERF, which she is not. So in translating, as you may all know, one must keep in mind the social and cultural context in which the public will read the final version of the book. Mm-hmm. As in Italy, there's a heated debate about identity and identities, as we have seen before. I had to choose each word used carefully. For instance, you might have noticed that I also eliminated the term race from the original and translated only ethnicity with ethnia. So I will elaborate on this on the next slide. In the Italian translation, I mainly use the word razza instead of ethnia to refer to race, despite the latter being a more appropriate term in Italian. So it was a deliberate choice for the reasons mentioned before, the socio-cultural context of Italy. So in Italian, there's a difference between ethnicity and race, which I think Federici had in mind when writing Beyond the Periphery of the Skin. Just ethnicity refers to the socio-cultural aspects of a group of people, whereas race refers mainly to physical features and behavior. Since in Italy, unlike in the US, correct me if I'm wrong, razza has become a word increasingly less used and only associated with racism, I decided to use it to remark on the concept that Federici is trying to convey here, that discrimination is based precisely on race, on attributes we can see and touch, and that the term possesses a derogatory accent. As a mixed person, I did have some reservation about using the word, even more so as the word race, razza, in Italian refers to something that doesn't exist, as razze doesn't exist. However, I ultimately chose to use it to highlight the discriminatory nature of how capitalism exploits race and ethnicity worldwide. I will conclude by saying that I believe that in Italy, we have a problem with terms referring to race, and this poses a challenge to any translator of feminist texts. For example, in her upcoming book, which will be published by the editore, Revolution at Point Zero will be republished because it has been published in Italian, but there are many, many parts missing from the original one. Federici extensively uses the acronym BIPOC, and one would say that in Italian it doesn't make sense to use it since it means Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And we historically have not had an extensive use of those words in isolation. One would think in Italian there is another term for BIPOC to adapt what is being said to the Italian context. But if you take a look at online communities, you'll see that Italian people use BIPOC as well. So I'm still asking myself if I should try to find a suitable translation or if I should leave it like that, since it has become of common usage. I don't know. I'll end this with I don't know.
Thank you, Christina.
I kind of wanted to build on some earlier papers today and talk a bit about my different idea of militant translation, or the idea that I have developed through my own work of militant translation. And my academic work is a lot to do with the notion of political inheritance in an Italian context, but also the notion of political inheritance as a form of translation. For some kind of unfortunate reasons, I haven't really been able to do everything I wanted to do in this talk, so I had to kind of curtail some of the ambitions that I had for it. But yeah, earlier, actually, Patricia said, when I went off to go and untangle this thought that I was having, she said, like, I'm going to the unnameable place, or the innommabile. And I was kind of moved by it because I feel like I really wanted to get at something to do with what is not named. This is partly to do with, what housework or reproductive labor was originally meant to do, and what ought to be named, other things that ought to be named. I also hope that my failure in this respect will help me have a different kind of reflection on this material. I just wanted to register, though, the kind of connective tissue that was going to hold up the talk. So I wanted to draw a link between housework and the political prisoner, or the notion of the political prisoner, and specifically instances of this in the present day through reflections on the philosophy of Abdullah Öcalan and genealogy, which is his idea of the science of women, which draws heavily on Federici and Maria Mias, who's another social reproduction feminist, I suppose. So I wanted to talk about the translation of Revolution at Point Zero, this text of Federici's, which occurred in Iran in, I think it was 2021, but I'm not exactly sure, by Sarvin Asamadi. She was jailed last year during the Zan Zindagi Azadi movement, and it's kind of unclear whether any of the material that she translated has anything to do with the kind of process that she had gone through. So from there, I also wanted to talk about Masa Amini and like the Kurdish context of this slogan, which was so important, and that origin, which is in Jinjan Azadi. And so the untranslatable element that I was like thinking about or trying to get at in this kind of chain of associations is this notion of genealogy, like genealogy, but also womanology. And I kind of the connection is like, it feels very resonant for me, even though it's not a language that I speak in. So David Graeber has also written of Öcalan's thought that there's kind of a pervasive silence about his thought in political philosophy, or serious political philosophy. And he writes that this is partly due to the Turkish state's intent to censor his thought, but he also claims that it often repels academics, given its direct interest in politics and its kind of flushness with a life and death struggle. I'm going to talk a bit about notions of subsistence and luxury, which directly come into his notion of housewifeization, and how he conceives of women's oppression as relating to colonization. so the question is kind of interestingly circular, but I guess I was curious about this question of academia, which often falls, unwittingly on the side of a seeming luxury, whether it wishes to or not. And I think there's an experience of shame associated to its contact with us. There's an experience of shame associated to the contact of this other philosophy with a struggle for subsistence, but the shame becomes associated with the subsistence and not the luxury. So this is just kind of talking a bit about, what I might have said. So this is up because I wanted to talk about the infamous opening lines of the 1975 Wages Against Housework pamphlet, and to register an immediate and persisting problem of translation, which announces itself, which is the translation of work into love and love into work. So there's an opening ambiguity to this phrase, a conversion and a gesture to a sort of conversion phenomena which never decides about their logical separability or not. Is there a kind of love or a fringe of love which contains no work? Is there ever work or unwaged work which doesn't exploit the resources of love? Or does this kind of work always build on hatred or pure instrumentality? These are some questions that it brings up, and different versions of those questions often come up when I teach this text. And so I wanted to talk about the operative term in this movement and how it relates to this idea of love and work, and its translation and how love and work are bound up there. This is kind of also a late addition, but I wanted to talk for a second about this conception of love, which I think I've taken from a book that's called Another Love, A Politics of the Unrequited by Asma Abbas. She writes, love is not the object for or instrument within, she's talking about her own book, love is not the object for or instrument within this work, but a series of objections articulated on behalf of politics from spaces and times often deemed either antithetical to, cleansed of, or a relief from politics. And politics, I take to be the capacity to produce meaning in common and to make real which, when it comes to those who are either scripted out of reality, made insensible within it, or have not always mattered, is the capacity to make sensible and material what has been denied sense and immaterialized. So her interest is in sketching the lineage of another kind of requited love. She appropriates this terminology of the unrequited not to reify or romanticize or idealize it, but instead to discover within its negative capacity the conditions behind which lie something more like a truly free expression of love. She writes, and this also is particularly resonant to me, she writes, it is really a remarkable day when someone grieves with you. All right, I think I was going to get upset. It's truly a remarkable day when someone grieves with you and does so beyond guilt, apology, corroboration, or exhibition without you asking for it. And in a gesture toward a world in which we can be together, it relieves you of being the exemplar, the exhibit. I can just read it again. So it is really a remarkable day when someone grieves with you and does so beyond guilt, apology, corroboration, or exhibition, without you asking for it. And in a gesture toward a world in which we can be together, relieves you of being the exemplar, the exhibit, the exception, or the uninvited host. So then she talks about an unreluctant abundance. She talks about an unreluctant abundance, the unaccursed share of a heart eager to fall in love, as if all our lives and the meaning of our deaths depended on it. In being about such love, this book is about politics. So I started out with writing the talk with an intent to discuss the Persian translations of, like I talked about, Silvio Federici's Revolution at Point Zero. Actually, you've already introduced, or a number of us have introduced Revolution at Point Zero, so I don't have to go too much into that, but she talks about, the conception of women's unremunerated labor, which she calls housework, but is also called lavoro domestico. So we have wages against housework, wages for housework. We also have il comitato per il salario per il lavoro domestico. I think that's how it goes. So the subject for this paper came out of an interest in the metonymic chains that might appear when we consider the translation of housework. I've been interested in this question for a long time, and when I think about why, I realize that the difficulties of translation here bring out a resonant division of myself and a personal split. So this split is precisely the difference which is alluded to but grouped together in lavoro domestico, or housework, of the split between waged reproductive work and unwaged housework. As having grown up in the inadvertently disorganized household of my single mother, who worked primarily when she could get work as what some might call a domestic worker, as a cleaner, and as a homemaid. So what some have discussed, and which I'll refer to below as the kind of, the difficult aspect of an impossible homemaking is meaningful to me. Both facets of this, so the waged reproductive work and unwaged housework, are involved in circumscribing freedom. So waged, reproductive, unwaged, and forced or enslaved are all kind of involved here. And here the domestic or house holds the weight of a number of perhaps misleading countries, as well as being different in different languages, because it spatializes a relation. Since the bestowal of a wage has historically deployed the rhetorical strategies of calling it free labor, or what Marx calls double freedom, which elsewhere I have written about in terms of how Marx actually writes this. He talks about Vogelfreiheit, which means being free as a bird. With all of its resonant legal and poetic meanings, it's the state of abandonment and vagabondage which is prerequisite to being exploited. So in the twisted interpretation of free labor, there is a kind of wrench. The boss's wishes get threaded into the workers, and freedom is only the freedom to be exploited. And this is woven together with the dispossessing logic of depriving the worker of land and rights, since the lack of bondage is positively coded, not just in moral terms, but also in terms of identification. So Nikhil Singh, for example, has talked about this, and he gestures towards the difference between the free worker and freed slave as underpinning a negative politicization of freedom in Marx, in which slavery becomes for Marx a form of insult and humiliation that distances the freed slave from achieving political agency. In the same manner of a genus-faced phrase, these are all like very closely woven threads, and sometimes even you can't see it, meaning their translation is hard. Productive labor isn't just useful labor or making use values, but labor which produces capital for the bosses. So productive there, one meaning of it would be productive means productive of capital, and its moralism is another kind of cynical liberalism, or another kind of cynical, concealment. I did want to talk a bit about Angela Davis's reading of Maria Rosa de la Costa's 1975 speech for a general strike, and it presses particularly on this difference between what's described as housework and domestic labor, which is differentially and overwhelmingly on the part of black women. She talks about in the United States and elsewhere, even if these different terms aren't differentiated as such by her. With its specific resonances, housework may conjure the image of a kind of suburban or leisurely housewife, lower to upper middle class, white housewife. This image of being kind of waited upon, I think, is some of the connections that one makes with housework. But it's something that isn't present in the English translation of lavoro domestico, domestic labor, in that this term refers back to centuries of class and racial rule, in which the domestic signified also an epithet connected to a relation within the household, referring to the domestic or the domestics or the help. So this might number among paid servants, but also might include enslaved people, debt-bonded people, or those experiencing other forms of forced labor. So the meaning also refers, this meaning also then refers, the meaning that is predominant in housework also then refers reproductive work to this white middle-class household, which becomes, and I think this is perhaps contrary to the original intent of wages for housework, it becomes the neutral model, and I think that it should not be its primary referent. So it's very clear in many of the writings at point zero that at least Federici, she writes explicitly of reproductive work as reproductive of labor power specifically, which is not the commodity that the middle-class household is built to produce and exchange. So in this respect, thinking about these kind of divisions within households, I wanted to bring up something that actually was written about the pandemic, and I think maybe it's interesting also to bring that in somehow into my thoughts, like I've been trying to integrate it in the last years. Angela Metropoulos she responded to the kind of weird remarks of Agamben at the beginning of the pandemic, and she said, "The key point here is that a tacit naturalization of the household and consequent neglect of inequalities both within and between actual households is a pervasive confounding error in political philosophy. It invites perennial dead-end debates between negative and positive concepts of liberty, to borrow Isaiah Berlin's terminology. Rarely does it raise explicit consideration of the tenets of private property law that underwrite the idea of legal personhood and potential or life chances implicit in both concepts of liberty. This error sets the racialized and gendered limits on presumptions of destiny and reckonings of justice through the course of the pandemic." This difference that I'm gesturing to in this division within housework, which Maria Mias has specifically talked about in her kind of more historical argument about the category or historical idea of the process of housewifeization. So she describes this as absolutely intertwined with colonization. So the first stage of this process she calls luxury for the ladies. It's the creation of a private sphere and luxury market which needed to be created for the success of the colonial world system as a profit-making enterprise, and a market for rare colonial luxury goods. She talks about this historian Werner Sombart who showed that these were primarily European women specifically, and then she says that she writes in response to him. She says, "Sombart, in my opinion, wrongly attributes this tendency to the individualism and impatience of leisure-class women who demanded immediate satisfaction of their desires as a sign of the affection of their lovers." I thought this was somewhat interesting because it kind of returns to love and its claim on work, but in this case, the claim is on the work of others, which is completely outside of the picture of it. So tendencies, and then she talks about the tendencies that emerge from this beginning, which then are carried into the notion of the family and of the private in general, which there's a tendency towards domestication and privatization in this privatized arena of consumption and love, not production and accumulation. Davis writes of freedom too. She quotes Du Bois' Starkwater at one point in her essay on Maria Rosa Dalla Costa, writing that black women have seldom been just housewives, but they have always done their housework. This is responding to Du Bois, who says, some few women are born free and some amid insult and scarlet letters achieve freedom. But our women in black had freedom contemptuously thrust upon them. So this really recalls some thoughts of her earlier Marxist feminist progenitor, Claudia Jones, who made a similar argument in 1949, writing that they, referring to a group of predominantly white feminists, cannot with equanimity or credibility speak of the black woman's place as in the home, for black women are in other people's kitchens. So that's from the End to the Neglect, this essay. I think one of the things that is relevant to translation in the work of Federici and also Dalla Costa and others is that they go on to propose a role of a struggle over the wage as being extremely significant, rather than a kind of reification of the wage as an end goal. So it's a site of struggle and a site of resistance. Federici responds to some critique in the 1970s, which is titled Women and Pay for Housework, and she says, it's just another but a most extreme example of reduction, distortion, and avoidance. Pay for housework misrepresents the issue, for it clearly ignores that a wage is not just a bit of money, but the fundamental expression of the power relation between capital and the working class. So here the wage becomes a conduit of translation, the material force which expresses socially necessary labor time or labor power, and it's deployed to create something new in exchange for money, which can then be turned back into use values. I wanted to discuss briefly also the other element in housework, and maybe I can end with this, which both Federici and Maria Mias bring to the fore in different ways, which is the element of house as home. They also bring up other theorists who talk about this a lot. Another writer in this regard is Bell Hooks in her notion of home place, where she writes of the construction of a home place both as a site of safety and emotional care, but also the place where resistance can first flourish. And so this is specifically thinking about, this notion of the reproductive space as one which refers to as a political struggle or a resistance. And I also, it also reminded me of something of the 19th century revolutionary philosopher Robert Wedderburn, who wrote of this specific capacity of the home place, as it were, in slavery, as a place which created a capacity for resistance, which may be aided in the kind of minimal but extremely important uses of land. And Robert Wedderburn is super interesting in he's part of the genesis really of the idea of the general strike, and often not really talked about in that respect. So maybe I'll just end on this. I think there's like this charged translational nexus between home, house, work, love, slavery, resistance, dependence. Recent philosophies of translation have often underscored the paucity or retraction of meaning associated with translation and the notion of untranslatability, which puts the slant on an underdetermination inherent in translation. But I wanted to claim, and this was kind of loosely following Öcalan's philosophy, which I didn't really talk about, that we might attend more closely to connections, associations, and thereby to a continual work of interpretation which doesn't crystallize into fixity, whether the oscillations of this interpretation are notated in some way in a translation or not. So in this sense, to kind of retrace the paths of fantasy that is involved in this overdetermination, what I would call like an overdetermination in translation. So I think I'm just going to end there.
Thank you so much. Okay, and finally, Marie.
Thank you very much to my panel comrades, and thank you for the invitation to this symposium. First of all, I'd like to express my epistemological premises, driving both my political and theoretical work, as well as my translation practices and studies. I inscribe all my work in a Black feminist Marxist standpoint epistemology, which I understand as an epistemology of domination and resistance. To put it in other words, my position within the interlocking system of oppression of gender, race, and class shapes my condition as an exploited subject, as well as my power of exploiting other and benefit from others' exploited conditions. My power and powerless position is in dialectic with my point of view, over, or rather in the world, shaping my capacity to observe it, to analyze it, as well as my attempts and urges to transform it. So I start from myself. I would summarize my standpoint as it follows. White skin, black name. I was assigned Italian nationality at birth, as my passport attests, just below in my family name, which I inherited from the first enslaved people in Haiti, Caribbean, who received surname after centuries of name obliteration. I inherited it through my father, who migrated to Italy from Haiti. Since then, our family's surname was Italianized, that is, translated according to the Italian pronunciation norms. There could be no more Moise. Italy welcomes only Moise or Moise. This is one of the reasons why my only mother tongue is Italian. My past, my history are inscribed in colonization, racialization, dehumanization, but the only language through which I processed that past is the colonial one. I know we could engage a broader historical analysis of the Italian tongue, but here I'll make my point with a brief statement. Italian is the language by which I name the first invader of my family's land, Cristoforo Colombo. I couldn't learn my father's tongue, namely the Haitian Creole, because Italian in my biography reproduced its colonizing function, which I define, following Spivak, as an epistemic violence. It invaded and uprooted the transmission of my paternal subaltern tongue and the entire colonial and decolonial history inscribed within it, in political, cultural, artistic terms. Uprooting has marked the past of all my ancestors in linguistic, corporeal, and existential terms. It is the legacies I inherited in the forms of an unspeakable, transgenerational colonial trauma, shaping my psychic, cognitive, and bodily structures, as well as my nonverbal codes of expression. Under these situated premises, I am to investigate the connection between the political translation of experience and the political experience of translation. I will focus on some of my co-translations works within the domain of Black Marxist feminism, particularly analyzing Women, Race and Class by Angela Davis, which I co-translated in 2018, Blues, Legacies and Black Feminism by Angela Davis again, and Where We Stand, Class Matters by Bell Hooks. Translated in this chronological order, these publications reflect the political demands that have progressively emerged in Italy within the anti-racist movements, with connections with the global political landscape. These translations mirror my progressive involvement in Black feminist Marxist activism, progressively re-elaborating the colonized, racialized backgrounds that affect us, the activists, our need to claim, to name, to translate, and transform it. These politically situated demands have been conveyed through the ongoing production of a specific vocabulary, reflecting our claims on the field of language as a strategic terrain of the anti-racist political struggle. From Angela Davis to Bell Hooks, I understand translation as a political act aiming not just at a recovery of an eradicated story of oppression following the linguistic canons of the oppression itself, but as the possibility to reconstruct bonds with those who, before me, have witnessed their own experience of oppression, transposing it in verbal terms so to denounce and challenge its actors and factors. In this sense, translation can set in motion a process of translinguistic healing of a past and present, individual and collective self that has been shattered by colonial epistemic violence. By translating Angela Davis' Blues, Legacies and Black Feminism with the Black feminist scholar Angelica Pesarini, who used to teach here, by the way, I learned how oppression narratives were historically used as a weapon in the hands of the abolitionist movements. Narrative of African people enslaved in North America, as Angela Davis writes, simultaneously transcended the slave system and encouraged its abolition. Translation in this sense is aimed at a recovery of the transformative potential power of those narratives, revealing the embodied force to resist oppression that allowed my ancestors to survive. Understanding myself as the living testimony of those forces to resist and survive that gave birth to us as descendants, my very existence can be understood as a living translation of an archive of struggles memories. I cannot celebrate other than keeping on translate them, in words and in practice. Just as Angela Davis highlights in her text, the translation of key terms regarding the experience of oppression and resistance doesn't merely involve an act of transferring a word from one language to another. Instead, it requires the ability to convey a transversal, psychological, emotional state from one linguistic system to another, one that links together, even in the diaspora, the memories of slave and colonial dehumanization. Translation in this sense doesn't establish a semantic correspondence between two signifiers, but rather a psychoaffective correspondence, which takes shape in the relationship between the semantic field of the concepts and the transformative political use that the anti-racist struggles have made of it. An example of this process is the Italian translation of the word race in the title of Angela Davis' book, Women, Race and Class, first translated in 1985 in Italian as bianche e nere, white and blacks at feminine. That translation choice cannot be dismissed as merely a product of its time. Especially in progressive Italian publishing, the word race has long been censored, echoing a widespread discomfort among the white Italian population linked to the use of the term razza during the fascist regime. For decades, and even today, there's been debate about removing the word razza from the Article 3 of the Italian Constitution, which states that all citizens are equal without any distinctions of race. Thus, translating women, race and class as bianche e nere seems to follow this political stance. The same one that seems to have determined the choice of Rainier Deleuge's book title, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, next slide, why I'm no longer talking to white people about racism. However, the political and psychological translation of oppression experience cannot be reduced to the white power's interpretation of it, nor it can correspond solely to the white voices that have contested it. On the contrary, the use of the word razza in Italian by contemporary Italian racialized generations is a politically transformative use of the term, reclaiming the existence of an oppressive political system still based on the ideology of race, which reproduces itself by denying the existence of race, but legitimizing and naturalizing its new signifiers, such as ethnicity, skin color differences, cultural differences, nationality, and so on. The necessity of the word razza is a politically situated need of those who, bearing the wounds of the system of domination on their own bodies, contest its pervasiveness, even in the ethical and sensory realm of its own challengers. So, translating the title of Angela Davis' work as Donne, Razza e Classe doesn't reduce the term race to that of razza as it was defined in the Manifesto della Razza or in the racial laws of 1938 in Italy. On the contrary, it imbues itself with the translinguistic and transnational political movement that has reinstated the political ideological nature of the term and its persistence in a so-called post-racial word. What's more, the translation of the word conveys a profound process of elaborating on a historical impotent rage. In the word razza, which stands out today in the title of the current Italian translation of Davis' text, a collective psychological process resonates. That process through which racialized subjects in Italy have achieved a new inner political, social, psychological consciousness concerning a long experience of silencing. Razza, as a matter of fact, becomes a new signifier whose sound expresses a new inner solidity even in the face of discomfort, anxiety, and defense mechanisms that cross the white audience as they hear or read that word. White discomfort, thus, can become a new element of the transformative anti-racist process by indicating to the white audience the way out of a comfort zone, the comfort zone of white privilege, which has long been the privilege of translating the other's oppression experience. Some examples of few publishing in the early years using the word race by racialized people in Italy. As Angela Davis argues in her theoretical work, the abolition of slavery in juridical terms did not eradicate the persistent racial hierarchy that categorizes living beings into differential statuses of humans, subhumans, non-humans. Contemporary hegemonic languages are still saturated with words of colonial origin, used uncritically in both everyday and theoretical discourse. Essentializing terms historically defined the taxonomy of racial otherness, and along with racial hate speech terms, they continue to perpetuate the racial colonial order as a discursive regime, along with its traumatic and performative effects on reality. A situated epistemology of resistance allows us to view translation as a tool for recognizing epistemic agency among the subjects of anti-racist struggles, creating a space to shape a counter-semiotics and a counter-semantics of colonial language on one hand, and a linguistic horizon of transformative justice on the other. To phrase it differently, or rather as a question, can translation function as an abolitionist practice? Can translation be seen as a political practice aimed at dismantling linguistic prisons in which oppressed subjects have been confined? This interrogation has guided other translation choices made by myself and others, always emphasizing the strategic centrality of keywords of self-definition developed by anti-racist movements in Italy and their claims. In 2019, 1 year after my Italian co-translation of Women, Race and Class, a group of racialized women wrote a letter in Italian to the mayor of Milan after he was photographed for a major Italian newspaper, Corriere della Sera. In the photograph, the mayor is seated, I won't show it, but in the photograph, the mayor is seated in a chair with a black girl at his feet, hugging his legs. In contestation of the racist representation, the authors of the letter sign it with their own names, surnames, and self-definition as black women, donna nera, with a capital N. The term nera, nero, with the capital N, has been used by various anti-racist and feminist movements throughout history as a means of subjectivizing their political agency, or, to borrow from Du Bois, as the substantiation of their own dignity as human beings. In the Italian translation of Women, Race and Class, the term black with a capital B has been translated as nero, nera, while maintaining the capital letter. This choice has raised eyebrows among adherents of Italian grammatical rules, given that, unlike English, attributes indicating nationality or ethnic belonging do not typically require a capital letter. In response to such objections, the choice of the capital N takes on further political significance as it dissociates the term nero nera from its assumed status as an ethnic national term, instead repositioning it as a product of political struggle within the material and symbolical terrain of racialization. Thanks to the globalization of Black Lives Matter movement, the circulation of the term nero nera has become a key term for self-definition among a new generation of anti-racist Italians, a trend reflected in specific literary productions in the Italian language. Manifesto di una donna nera italiana, l'unica persona nera nella stanza, fortunatamente nera, nera conforme. The authors who claim the term nera, nero, have subverted the hegemonic meaning of the word in Italian, which has long been identified and criticized from a white, politically correct perspective as an inappropriate term. The correct term would be persona di colore. Literally, I could translate person of color, but now I go on to analyze it. The expression persona di colore in Italian carries a specific racial implication. People who have a color deviate from the white norm, which doesn't require any term to be distinguished. only non-white people would be considered people of some color. Upon closer examination, even the term in English, as it was used by Angela Davis, is proposed as a reclaimed word from its origin in colonial codes, which distinguished between free people and free people of color during times of slavery. People of color were those who achieved freedom during their lifetime or who were born free from the union of a free person with a non-free one. The racial unthought shaping the expression persona di colore makes the translation of the English term people of color or women of color quite problematic. In contrast to the Italian expression, the Anglophone term people of color responds to the limits of the category of blackness, which hardly define the experience of racism when not linked to the history of the African diaspora. As a matter of fact, a segment of the anti-racist political and cultural movement has advocated for the search for an umbrella term that does not invisibilize experiences of racism other than those of the black diaspora. And this is exemplified by Nadisha Uyangoda, the authors of L'unica persona nella stanza, an Italian black author whose blackness is the result of racist insults she received in terms of N-words, despite being the daughter of migrants from Sri Lanka. Uyangoda's critique is symptomatic of a politicization process that progressively seeks the missing words, le parole che ci mancano, in Italian. Again, the title of an anti-racist media campaign promoted by a group of activists who began using a new term to define themselves, racialized persons. The term persone razzializzate, racialized persons, has progressively become a key term to define a political subject increasingly aware that racism in Italy affects a multiplicity of social groups, variably ethnicized, which cannot all be encompassed by the term black people as an umbrella term. Thus, the Italian translation of the term women of color and people of color in historical black feminist text cannot avoid a comparison with the emerging lexicon of contemporary Italian black feminism. While Davis gives voices to those she calls women of color, the Italian translation of her work in 2022 transposes the term to donne razzializzate, racialized women. From a black feminist perspective, the political translation of the experience of oppression is itself a political experience. Translation not only reflects, but also fuels the processes of political subjectivation, participating in the healing, abolition of linguistic and material prisons of oppression, and the construction of new linguistic horizons of transformative justice. Translation, as a situated practice, implies a consideration of the translator's social position and power dynamics, which shape their worldview as inherently partial viewpoints, both epistemologically and politically. The concept of position has been particularly thought-provoking for me during the translation of Bell Hooks' work, Where We Stand, released in Italian in 2023, as Da che parte stiamo. The term posizione in Italian is an ambivalent one because it denotes both a fixed spatial and power-related position, as well as the potential to take a stand, akin to the English verb to stand and take a stand. Hooks' work brilliantly illuminates the connection between position and to take a stand. Thus, asking ourselves where we stand prompts us to consider not only our epistemic and social standpoint, but also our political position. The urgency with which Hooks posed this question over 20 years ago at the time when I had the opportunity to translate it, remains relevant in our current political moment. We are increasingly aware of our positions of privilege or disadvantage and our experiences of oppressions, thanks to the global dissemination of key concepts shaping critical analysis of power system. However, static awareness of our position is insufficient given the gravity of contemporary global issues rooted in colonial epistemic and political violence. Where we stand, da che parte stiamo, must resonate today in Italian and in all the existing tongues all over the world as an urgent call to decide which side to take and to translate this decision into collective political practices aimed at creating a more just world. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I love how this talk has forefronted how translators manage categories like race and ethnicity and gender and class, and I just thank you all for your beautiful presentations. I wanted to ask, we don't have too much time for questions, and I want you guys to ask questions to each other too, because I feel like there were so many interesting resonances. So if you think of one, please feel free to ignore my question and go with another one. But I was interested in this kind of question of translation across time, especially with these figures like Angela Davis and Silvia Federici, and what you had mentioned, Tiana, about the evolution of Federici's thought and how she kind of reflected upon, graciously but belatedly, her stance and the kind of the development of the wages for housework movement rooted in a kind of black welfare kind of example. And so I wondered, you just thinking about both Angela Davis and Silvia Federici, if you had any thoughts on their evolution, and also as you've translated a more recent Silvia Federici piece, if you had any thoughts on that too, Patricia.
I mean, you can see the evolution of her thought in the Revolution at Point Zero, but mainly the editor will publish it with two more essays that have never been published before, where she explores more about the role of women in the house. And I guess she continued to elaborate on that throughout her life. So I think it's an ongoing process for her as well, I guess.
In Swedish, there is the same issue around uttering the word race, having to do with a different history around the Institute for Racial Biology in Sweden. If you say race, you're enacting or reenacting a kind of history. And so in Swedish as well, the solution is to speak of racialized people, people of color, because the BIPOC issue exists for all of us who translate texts by people of color into different languages. But my question is, when being racialized is assigned only to people of color, it ignores that white people are racialized as well. And so I've never, as someone who translates into Swedish, I'm never quite satisfied saying that, writing that a person of color is a racialized person, because it assumes a sort of baseline around who is and isn't racialized. I do exactly what you do, but I'm also wondering about how to generate a term that also signals that white people are as racialized as people of color, and as implicated in the operations of structural racism. So. Wait, you have to deliver a response and a solution.
Well, actually, in my interrogations, I prefer, as Magda Gebremariam Tesfaye said this morning, to think of racialized people as a most pertinent way to define the process and the subjects affected by the process. So shifting from a most identitary lexicon to one of identifying the process and giving us the possibility to constantly understand race as you all stated, as a floating signifier. I think this is at stake, even in the way we choose.
Thank you. That was really rich, and I have a lot of questions, but just to be fast, I have a quick, or maybe not so quick question for Tiana about the word example. Like, I'm wondering how the example differs from the symbol, differs from the, instrument. And because I've been reading in the break pretty closely again, and it's amazing what he wants to make of the mother figure in that work. So yeah, if you could just kind of gloss for us like how that term is working for you.
Yeah, thank you. And it's something that, my work is in progress, and you said the mother figure, and figure and figuration have become another way for me to talk about example that is perhaps less instrumental, although the instrumentality is exactly what I'm trying to get at, right? The gesture to in order to get somewhere else. And in the background somewhere is, sort of like deconstructionist theories of the example. But I've been seeing it in different places, and I think example, especially in this talk, becomes a sort of a little bit of a catch-all where maybe there's example here, there's also figuration, there's also symbol, there's also trope, and then somewhere, below that is maybe stereotype, naming, all sorts of things. They're all sort of like a constellation. So I'm not especially tied to example, but I think example, the key thing for me is the instrumentality, the pointing to in order to reach some broader, often romantic and just impossible place.
Thank you to the whole panel. And I want to show my thanks with another question about words. This would be for Tiana and Christina, but for everybody, really. It's emerging from a section of Hannah Arendt's The Human Condition, where she talks about words in mostly Romance languages for labor and work, and how there's this, I'll leave it at the hierarchy, but her main point is that labor is almost essentially alienated. Work is more creative, it leaves something behind, as it's most commonly used. And this goes back to the Latin root. I mean, think of you talk about the collected works of a poet, the oeuvre of a poet, not the collected labors of a poet. But the paradox here is that the work of the mother-to-be in childhood is rigorously called labor. You go into labor, you don't go into work. And when I hear your remarks, Tiana, on the social reproduction theory, and that's not ever purely a metaphor, there is physical reproduction. And Christina, your slide, it was the manifesto. Forgive me, was it wages for or wages against? Wages against housework, where the miscarriage was called remind me, a work accident? Yeah, okay. So that seems to be ameliorative, or at least it seems to go to the paradox where the most creative act there is now being called work. And instead of just imagining that this is amelioration, I would really like to ask, is that an intentional intervention on behalf of the manifesto? And I just like to, really I just want to kind of shout out Hannah Arendt and that paradox and hear where the resonances might be with that.
I'm sorry, I have to go, and I wanted to thank you and say goodbye to everybody. I have a train not to miss, sorry. And thank you very much, guys. Thank you. Bye.
Ciao, ciao.
Yeah, can you just explain what you mean by amelioration when you're talking about that?
Amelioration in that it, I won't say resolves the paradox, but what I'm imagining is it is confronting the paradox where this creative act of childbirth is in everyday language referred to with labor, which I don't mean to demean at all, but just to point out Hannah Arendt's point that it is only in childbirth that labor is used for the thing that leaves a work behind. And that if childbirth is now being called work, is that a intentional intervention?
So
That's what I'm...
As in you're saying, by recasting labor as work, would that be trying to ameliorate something? Yeah. I don't know. I don't know exactly what, I think also a lot of the Marxist feminists who I read, don't actually talk so much about the politics of biological reproduction. And so it's kind of more of an expanded conception of reproduction. And that kind of gets into the social reproduction is to some degree economistic. It's about economy of the reproduction. But then there's also political reproduction. So, you could take it in many different directions. I don't know actually. I'm not that keen on the Hannah Arendt distinctions between different forms of work because I feel like there's a specter of hierarchy that comes from. To me, when I read that part of Hannah Arendt, I think of its kind of genealogy or its influence from Aristotelian ideas from the politics, and also, those are probably, people know this, or it's famously kind of very constituted by gender and race. So I'm kind of I hesitate to sign up to them, and I think, there's something Aristotle makes the distinction between praxis, poiesis, and some other form of work. And I think this is lingering in the background of what Hannah Arendt is saying. There's an inability to see that, perhaps. I also wanted to say something briefly about the comments about racialized. It's interesting because I was thinking of the terms enslaved. You talk about the enslavers. It's just funny that people go around saying racialized, when you don't talk about who racializes. So that's a kind of strange aspect of it that's completely passive without actually naming what is happening there. And even, I can use the term racialized or something, but it doesn't imply that we're, or I am involved. So I feel like that could be another thing to think about. It's white people may be racialized, but if we're talking about racialization as a process of also oppression, then they would be more something like racializers than racialized. Thinking the different relationships there, I guess, or actually thinking what are the relations rather than the fixed positions or something.
Yeah, I just to respond a little bit, not answer, but to respond to your question, I've wrestled a lot with the various distinctions theorists make between labor and work, and W.E.B. Du Bois, and then there's also this question of activity, right, as this other thing. W.E.B. Du Bois, and this is where my kind of dissertation 10 years ago started, has this idea of world work. And so for him, work is similar to, he lived to almost 100, so I'm talking about his later work, but work was really sort of like a life's work. It was very sort of universalized. It was very interested in a global understanding of humanism. But women and, sex workers and so many people were excluded from that world work. He comes from a sort of Victorian era. And so I kind of got I became less interested in distinctions between labor and work, just in the sense of my own stuff. Labor and work I use them interchangeably. And I think for me, the end goal, is really just like the end of work as we know it, which is really sort of what I would like to see.
Sounds good.
Maybe that's a good place to end in this, I think. So.
Yes.
Thank you guys so much. It was beautiful.